But today is not about anyone up here on this stage. It's not about the President, the Secretary of Defense, me, CQ. It's not about us. It's about something much larger than all of us. It's about our democracy. It's about our republic. We are unique among the world's armies. We are unique among the world's militaries. We don't take an oath to a country. We don't take an oath to a tribe. We don't take an oath to a religion. We don't take an oath to a king or a queen or to a tyrant or a dictator. And we don't take an oath to a wannabe dictator. We don't take an oath to an individual. We take an oath to the Constitution, and we take an oath to the idea that it's America, and we're willing to die to protect it.
All right, friends, welcome back to Dr. John Podcast. So this has just happened, guys. A 4-star general called Trump a traitor to his face on live television. Not in a closed-door meeting, not through an anonymous leak, but openly, on camera, viewed by millions. Trump's response wasn't a factual rebuttal or a defense of his record. He lost control, turned his back, and stormed out while the room descended into chaos.
Are you expecting chaos on Election Day?
No, I don't think so. Not from the side that votes for Trump.
But I'm just wondering if these outside agitators will start up on Election Day.
I think the bigger problem is the enemy from within, not even the people that have come in and destroying our country. By the way, totally destroying our country. The towns, the villages, they're being inundated. But I don't think they're the problem in terms of Election Day. I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military, because they can't let that happen.
The footage has transcended ordinary viral content to become something closer to a national obsession. Within hours of the confrontation, the numbers told a story of their own. Over 22,000 posts spread across every platform. The hashtag #TraitorTrump trending nationwide with the kind of sustained intensity that signals a genuine cultural moment rather than a manufactured controversy. Veterans groups began issuing statements, some in support of the general, others condemning his breach of protocol, and the divisions within that community reflected the broader fractures that this incident has exposed.
This is among the reasons I believe so strongly that a second Trump term would be a huge risk for America and dangerous. Donald Trump is increasingly unstable and unhinged. And he is out for unchecked power. That's what he's looking for.
Legal analysts scrambled to interpret what had just occurred, debating questions of military discipline, free speech protections, and the constitutional definition of treason with an urgency that legal debates rarely command. Political commentators across the ideological spectrum recognized immediately that they were witnessing something that would reshape the landscape of American politics for the remainder of Trump's presidency and beyond. The fundamental reason this confrontation carries such extraordinary weight is that nothing comparable has ever occurred in the history of the Republic.
In newly revealed conversations between General Milley and the author Bob Woodward, written about in Bob Woodward's new book, War, General Milley felt compelled to clarify and articulate his concern about the future of our country should Donald Trump ever return to power. He cornered Bob Woodward at a 200-person reception in March 2023 and said this, quote, "He is the most dangerous person ever. I had suspicions when I talked to you about his mental decline, and so forth. But now I realize he's a total fascist. He is the most dangerous person to this country," end quote. A fascist to the core, General Milley repeated. Bob Woodward said he will never forget the intensity of Milley's worry in that moment.
Presidents have clashed with generals before, The tension between civilian authority and military expertise is woven into the fabric of American governance, and history provides numerous examples of heated disagreements between commanders-in-chief and the officers who serve under them. But a four-star general confronting a sitting president on live television and leveling the most serious accusation that can be made against any American, the charge of treason itself, is territory for which no precedent exists. The norms that once governed civil-military relations, the unwritten rules about respect and deference, and the proper channels for dissent have been not merely bent, but shattered entirely. And the manner in which Trump responded, the visible fury, the accusations hurled in return, the threats that followed on social media in the hours afterward have only deepened the sense that something fundamental has broken in the relationship between the president and the institution that is sworn to defend the Constitution. The reconstruction of events from the viral footage and the reporting that has emerged in the aftermath reveals a sequence that unfolded with the speed of a catastrophe. Trump was attending a public event, the kind of appearance where cameras are positioned everywhere and every gesture is captured for posterity. The setting was designed to project normalcy, the standard imagery of a president fulfilling the ceremonial obligations of his office, while the machinery of government continued to function around him. A four-star general was present among the attendees, and while the precise identity of the officer has not been confirmed with absolute certainty in every report, the overwhelming weight of analysis points to Mark Milley. The name carries enormous significance because Milley served as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during a substantial portion of Trump's first term, a position that placed him at the center of every significant military decision and every conflict between the Pentagon and the White House. Milley has been publicly critical of Trump in the period since his service concluded, and the history between these two men is a history of mutual suspicion, escalating confrontation, and accusations that have grown more serious with each passing year. The moment of the confrontation itself appears to have been spontaneous, though the underlying tensions that made it possible had been building for years. The general approached Trump directly, establishing eye contact in a manner that left no ambiguity about his intention to be heard. The words he spoke were not hedged with qualifiers or softened with diplomatic language. He did not express concern or raise a question or suggest that certain actions might be interpreted unfavorably. He stated it as a fact, as a conclusion reached after years of observation and reflection. "You are a traitor." The words hung in the air, captured by every microphone in the vicinity, and the footage shows Trump's reaction with merciless clarity. His face flushed with a rush of blood that was visible even through the layers of television makeup. He began to formulate a response, his mouth opening to issue what would presumably have been a counterattack of considerable ferocity. But then something shifted in his demeanor, some calculation, or perhaps simply the overwhelming force of an emotion that could not be channeled into words. And instead of responding, he simply turned and walked. He stormed out of the room, abandoning the event and the audience and the cameras, leaving behind a scene of pandemonium as attendees shouted and security personnel scrambled to adjust to the sudden departure of the principal they were assigned to protect. The legal questions that this confrontation raises are genuinely complex and resist easy resolution. Can a military officer, particularly one of such elevated rank, call the president a traitor without facing consequences under the Uniform Code of Military Justice? The answer depends heavily on the officer's status at the time of the statement. Active duty personnel operate under significant restrictions on political speech and public criticism of civilian leadership. Retired officers retain greater latitude, their First Amendment protections expanding once they have separated from active service, though even retired flag officers remain subject to certain provisions of military law and can face consequences including the loss of rank or pension in extreme circumstances. The distinction between protected speech and insubordination has been debated in military courts and civilian tribunals for decades, and this case would test those boundaries in ways that existing precedent may not adequately address. The political commentary that erupted in the aftermath followed entirely predictable patterns, while simultaneously revealing the depth of polarization that now characterizes American public discourse. Democrats and critics of the Trump administration celebrated the general as a hero who had finally done what countless politicians and pundits had failed to do, which was to tell Donald Trump the truth about his conduct to his face without flinching or retreating. The narrative they advanced was that someone with unimpeachable credentials, someone whose entire career represented service and sacrifice and expertise, had validated what they had been arguing for years. Republicans and Trump's defenders responded with outrage that was equally intense, characterizing the confrontation as the most dramatic manifestation yet of the deep state resistance that Trump had been warning about since the earliest days of his political career. They argued that an unelected military officer had no right to publicly denounce the elected commander-in-chief, that the chain of command existed for essential reasons, and that the general's actions represented precisely the kind of insider sabotage that threatened democratic accountability. The middle ground, as always in contemporary American politics, was virtually uninhabited. Everyone interpreted the event through the lens they had already adopted, and the interpretations only served to push the two camps further apart. Trump's response, after he stormed out of the room, deserves particularly careful examination because it reveals patterns of thought and behavior that have characterized his approach to criticism throughout his public life. He retreated to his preferred platform, the social media network where his messages reach his most devoted followers without the mediation of journalists or fact-checkers, and he unleashed a torrent of accusations and insinuations. He did not name the general directly, though the lack of a name fooled no one. The target of his fury was unmistakable to anyone who had followed the footage or the reporting. He declared that this general was part of the resistance, that shadowy network of bureaucrats and military officers and intelligence professionals who had supposedly been working to undermine his presidency from its inception. He claimed that this general had been conspiring against him since the beginning, that the confrontation on live television was merely the public manifestation of a treasonous agenda that had been operating in secret for years. He insisted that the general, not himself, was the real traitor, inverting the accusation and hurling it back at his accuser. Then Trump took the rhetoric into territory that sent chills through anyone with even a passing familiarity with how authoritarian leaders talk about their opponents. He began discussing historical punishments for treason. He invoked the specter of execution, reminding his audience that in earlier periods of American history and throughout the history of other nations, traitors had been put to death. He referenced Benedict Arnold, the name that has become synonymous with betrayal in the American lexicon, and he spoke about what happened to those who committed the ultimate crime against their country. The implication was not subtle. It did not require interpretive expertise to decode. The President of the United States, in response to being called a traitor by a military officer, was publicly musing about how traitors used to be killed. His defenders immediately mobilized to provide the sanitized interpretation, insisting that he was simply making a historical observation, that he was educating his followers about the traditional understanding of treason rather than issuing any kind of threat. But this defense collapses under the weight of basic common sense. When the most powerful person in the world, hours after being publicly humiliated by a specific individual, posts about how people like that individual used to face execution, the context transforms the historical observation into something far more menacing. The language functions as a threat, whether the explicit words of a threat are present or not. The audience understands what is being communicated, even if the communication is structured to provide plausible deniability. The implications of this rhetoric for political violence deserve serious consideration, and they cannot be dismissed as alarmism. Trump possesses a demonstrated track record of his words inspiring his supporters to take action. The events that culminated in the attack on the Capitol demonstrated conclusively that when Trump identifies someone as an enemy, when he labels them a traitor or a threat, a certain percentage of his followers will interpret that as a call to action. Most will not. The overwhelming majority of people who support Donald Trump are not violent and have no intention of harming anyone. But the mathematics of large populations are unforgiving. When you communicate to millions of people that a specific individual is a traitor and that traitors historically deserved execution, the probability that at least one person will decide to translate those words into action approaches certainty. This is how political assassinations become possible. This is how the temperature of political conflict rises rises from heated disagreement to physical violence. Trump either does not understand this dynamic, which would represent a staggering failure of judgment for someone in his position, or he understands it perfectly well and does not care, which would represent something considerably worse. The history between Trump and Milley, assuming Milley is indeed the general in question, provides essential context for understanding how this confrontation became possible and why the mutual animosity has reached such toxic levels. Milley served as Trump's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff from the middle of 2019 through the conclusion of Trump's first term and into the opening phase of the subsequent administration. During that period, Milley found himself at the center of multiple crises that tested the relationship between military leadership and the commander-in-chief. The most famous of these occurred during the protests that swept American cities following the killing of George Floyd. Trump, viewing the unrest through a lens that prioritized displays of strength and the projection of dominance, wanted to invoke the Insurrection Act and deploy active-duty military forces to suppress protests in American streets. Milley and other senior military leaders mounted a sustained and forceful resistance to this proposal. They argued that using the military for domestic law enforcement was inappropriate, that it would violate fundamental principles about the separation of military and civilian spheres, and that it would place service members in an impossible position. They threatened to resign in significant numbers if Trump proceeded with the plan. Trump ultimately backed away from the proposal, but he never forgave the military leaders who had opposed him. From his perspective, their resistance was not principled advice provided through proper channels. It was insubordination, a refusal to execute the lawful orders of the commander-in-chief, evidence that the military leadership considered itself accountable to something other than the president's authority. The incident at St. John's Church compounded the damage and deepened the personal dimension of the conflict. Trump's decision to clear Lafayette Square of protesters and stage a photo opportunity at the church, holding a Bible aloft while administration officials and military leaders in uniform stood nearby, became one of the defining images of his presidency. Milley was present at that event, wearing his uniform, and the visual association of military leadership with what was widely perceived as a political stunt created a firestorm of criticism. In the aftermath, Milley expressed public regret for his presence at the event. He said he should not have been there. He said his appearance in uniform had created the impression that the military was taking sides in a political dispute, and he characterized his participation as a mistake. From Trump's perspective, this was an unforgivable betrayal. Milley had not merely disagreed with him privately. Milley had publicly distanced himself from Trump's actions, essentially validating the criticism that the photo opportunity had been inappropriate. Trump viewed this as Milley prioritizing his own reputation over loyalty to the president who had elevated him to the highest military position in the country. The most extraordinary dimension of the Trump-Milley conflict emerged during the transition period following the election that Trump lost. Reports surfaced that Milley harbored genuine fears about what Trump might attempt as his time in office drew to a close. The concerns were not abstract. Milley and other senior military leaders reportedly held discussions about how they would respond if Trump issued illegal orders, if he attempted to use the military to retain power in defiance of the electoral outcome. The most explosive report indicated that Milley had contacted his counterpart in the Chinese military to provide assurances that the United States was not planning a surprise attack, and that if Trump ordered any such action, the Chinese would receive advance warning. From Trump's perspective, this represented the ultimate betrayal. A military officer communicating with a foreign adversary about the president's potential actions, essentially promising to undermine the commander-in-chief's authority if that authority was exercised in ways the officer deemed dangerous. Trump characterized this as collusion with America's enemies, and he has repeatedly suggested that Milley's actions constituted treason in the most literal sense of the term. The two completely opposed narratives about these events are now irreconcilable, and they represent the fundamental divide that made the live television confrontation not merely possible, but perhaps inevitable. In Trump's narrative, Milley was a key figure in the deep state conspiracy to sabotage his presidency from within, a treacherous insider who used his position to undermine the elected commander-in-chief and who ultimately collaborated with foreign powers to constrain American military options. In Milley's narrative and in the assessment of many military and national security professionals, he was executing his constitutional duty to prevent the misuse of military power by a president who had demonstrated that he could not be trusted with the full authority of his office. The two interpretations cannot be reconciled because they proceed from entirely different premises about where loyalty is ultimately owed. Trump believes loyalty is owed to him personally, that the chain of command exists to translate his will into action. Milley and those who share his perspective believe loyalty is owed to the Constitution, and that the oath military officers take is to a document and a system of government, rather than to any individual who temporarily occupies the Oval Office. The general who confronted Trump, whether Milley specifically or another officer of comparable rank, apparently decided that the accumulation of evidence had reached a threshold where silence became complicity. The accusation of treason is not a casual insult. It is the most serious charge that can be leveled against any American, and the Constitution defines it with deliberate narrowness. Treason consists only of levying war against the United States or adhering to their enemies by giving them aid and comfort. The evidentiary requirements are extraordinarily stringent, requiring either a confession in open court or the testimony of two witnesses to the same overt act. Most legal experts would argue that Trump's behavior, however norm-shattering and however threatening to democratic institutions, does not satisfy the constitutional definition of treason. The general who called him a traitor on live television was likely using the term in a broader, colloquial sense, rather than in its technically precise legal meaning. But the fact that a four-star general, someone who has been present in the most classified briefings and the most sensitive national security discussions, someone who has observed Trump's conduct from the closest possible proximity, has reached the conclusion that the president has betrayed the country, carries a weight that technical legal definitions cannot entirely dissipate. Even if the accusation is legally imprecise, it reflects a genuine and deeply considered assessment from someone uniquely positioned to make such judgments. The breakdown in civil-military relations that this confrontation represents is not merely symbolic. It has practical consequences for how the government functions and for national security. The American system depends fundamentally on civilian control of the military, a principle that is essential to democratic governance and that distinguishes free societies from military dictatorships. The president serves as commander-in-chief, and military officers are obligated to follow lawful orders and respect the chain of command. But that system also depends on military leaders providing honest and candid advice, pushing back when they believe proposed actions are illegal or unwise, and serving as a check on civilian leaders who might be tempted to misuse military power for improper purposes. The confrontation on live television has damaged both sides of this delicate balance. It has undermined the norm that military officers do not publicly challenge civilian leadership, and it has reinforced the perception that the president views the military as an instrument of personal power rather than an institution with its own professional standards and constitutional obligations. Trump's response, the accusations of treason hurled back at the general and the dark musings about historical executions, exacerbates every dimension of this crisis. It creates a chilling effect on military officers who might otherwise feel compelled to speak out about concerning behavior. The calculation becomes straightforward and grim. If speaking out means being publicly branded a traitor by the president and implicitly threatened with the ultimate punishment, the personal cost of principled dissent becomes almost impossibly high. Officers who might have provided valuable checks on presidential overreach will instead keep their heads down and their mouths shut, calculating that their careers and perhaps their safety depend on invisibility. This is precisely the dynamic that enables the misuse of military power. When the people who should be providing internal resistance are intimidated into silence, the guardrails that protect against authoritarian abuse of the armed forces begin to crumble. The broader politicization of the military that this incident accelerates represents a danger that extends far beyond any single presidency. The military's legitimacy depends on its reputation for nonpartisan professionalism, for serving the country as a whole rather than any political faction. When the president attacks generals who criticize him and praises those who demonstrate personal loyalty, when the public begins to perceive military leaders as aligned with one party or one ideological camp, the foundation of trust that supports the entire institution begins to erode. Once the military becomes politicized, once it is seen as just just another player in partisan conflicts, rather than an institution that stands apart from them, the path toward using the armed forces as a tool of political repression becomes disturbingly short. The social media dimension of this event has functioned as an accelerant, spreading the confrontation to every corner of the public consciousness and hardening the divisions that it exposed. The footage of the general calling Trump a traitor will persist indefinitely, embedded in campaign advertisements and debate montages and the endless churn of political content that shapes public perception. For Trump's opponents, it will serve as validation from the highest levels of military authority that their assessment of the president is correct. For Trump's supporters, it will serve as confirmation that the deep state conspiracy they have been warned about is real and that it will stop at nothing, including having uniformed officers publicly betray the commander-in-chief to destroy the man they believe is fighting for them. Both interpretations draw strength from the same event, and the mutual reinforcement of opposing narratives pushes the country further from any possibility of shared understanding. The veterans community has fractured along lines that mirror the broader political divisions, and this fracturing carries its own particular tragedy. People who served together, who shared the experience of military life and the values that experience instills, now find themselves unable to agree on the most fundamental questions about what happened and what it means. Some veterans, shaped by careers that emphasized the sanctity of the chain of command and the importance of military discipline, believe the general crossed a line that should never be crossed and should face the consequences of his actions. Other veterans, shaped by the same institutional experience but drawing different conclusions about the nature of the current threat, believe Trump represents such a danger to the country that extraordinary measures are justified and that speaking out was the only ethical choice available. The arguments playing out in veterans' communities, in social media threads and organizational statements and private conversations among former service members demonstrate that even the shared experience of military service cannot bridge the chasm that Trump's presidency has opened. The question of what consequences the general will face remains unresolved, and the answer will reveal a great deal about the current state of military independence and the extent of Trump's control over the institutions that are supposed to constrain him. If the general is retired, the legal landscape is more favorable to him, as retired officers enjoy greater free speech protections than their active duty counterparts. But even retired officers can face repercussions, including the loss of rank or pension in extreme cases, and Trump will undoubtedly demand that something be done. He will pressure the Pentagon leadership to take action, and the response of those leaders will constitute a test of their willingness to resist presidential pressure when that pressure is directed at punishing dissent. If they capitulate, if they find some mechanism to sanction the general for his public statement, the precedent will be set that criticizing the president carries career-ending consequences, and the chilling effect on other potential dissenters will be profound. If they resist, if they find ways to protect the general while navigating the political firestorm, they will have preserved some measure of institutional independence at the cost of Trump's fury and the retaliation that will almost certainly follow. The potential for this incident to inspire additional military leaders to speak out introduces another variable into an already volatile situation. The general's example could function as a permission structure, signaling to other officers who harbor similar concerns that public expression is possible. But the backlash and the threats that followed could just as easily function as a deterrent, demonstrating the price of dissent and encouraging everyone else to remain silent. The calculation each potential speaker must make is intensely personal, weighing the obligation they feel against the consequences they fear, and the aggregate result of those individual calculations will determine whether this moment becomes an isolated incident or the beginning of a broader reckoning. The damage to institutional norms that this confrontation represents will persist long after the specific individuals involved have departed the stage. The precedents established during Trump's presidency, the things that are now understood to be possible, the lines that have been crossed and cannot be uncrossed, will shape the behavior of future presidents and future military leaders for decades. The idea that a president can publicly attack and threaten military officers who disagree with him, that the military can be treated as a political instrument rather than a professional institution, that personal loyalty to the president matters more than loyalty loyalty to the Constitution, these ideas have been normalized through repetition. Future occupants of the Oval Office, observing how Trump wielded power and what he was able to achieve, will face strong incentives to follow his example. The restoration of norms that have been shattered is far more difficult than their initial preservation, and the work of rebuilding what has been destroyed will require sustained effort over a period that may extend well beyond any single administration. The confrontation between Trump and the general is not merely drama or spectacle. Though it possesses both qualities in abundance, it is a symptom of institutional decay that has been progressing for years. A decay that has now reached a stage where its manifestations are impossible to ignore. The spectacle captures attention, but the underlying disease is what should command concern. The relationship between the presidency and the military, the norms that govern how power is exercised and constrained, the trust that citizens place in the institutions that are supposed to protect them, all of these have been damaged in ways that will require generations to repair. And the footage of a four-star general calling the president a traitor on live television, and the president storming out in response, will remain as evidence of how far the rot has spread.